I stood outside the private dining room at Bistro Lumière, my hand frozen on the brass door handle as I heard my name being discussed inside. Through the slightly cracked door, I could see my manager, Brandon Walsh, gesturing enthusiastically to the restaurant's owner, Harold Blackstone, while my co-workers nodded in agreement around the mahogany table. Victoria Sterling has been with us for 3 years, but honestly, she lacks the leadership qualities we need for the assistant manager position, Brandon said, his voice carrying the confident tone he used when he thought no one important was listening. Kimber Stone, the head server who I'd trained when she started 6 months ago, laughed softly. She's always been too quiet, too passive. Not restaurant management material. I had arrived early for what I thought was a staff meeting about the upcoming renovation and expansion. Instead, I was discovering that my colleagues were systematically discussing why I shouldn't be promoted to the position I'd been working toward for 2 years. Victoria is reliable for basic tasks, added Austin Hayes, our sous chef. But she doesn't have the vision or connections to help us transform this place into the flagship location Mr. Blackstone wants. Harold Blackstone leaned back in his chair. So you're all in agreement? The assistant manager position goes to Kimber, and we restructure Victoria's role to something more suitable for her skill level. My chest tightened, but my expression remained perfectly calm. I had perfected this mask over years of working in hospitality, smiling through difficult customers and challenging situations. Now I used it to hide the fact that my heart was breaking. Absolutely, Brandon confirmed. Kimber has the personality and ambition to help us compete with the other high-end establishments in the district. I stepped back from the door and walked quietly to the employee break room, my mind already shifting from shock to strategy. They thought I lacked vision and connections. They believed I was too passive to lead. If only they knew what I'd been planning for the past 4 months. My phone buzzed with a text from my attorney. Blackstone accepted the offer. Papers signed. You now own Bistro Lumière. Congratulations, Miss Sterling. I smiled for the first time in weeks. Sometimes the best way to handle exclusion is to buy the whole game. I sat in the break room, sipping tea from my personal mug, a simple white ceramic piece that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Though none of my co-workers knew that. They saw what I wanted them to see, a quiet, dedicated employee who kept her head down and did her job well. The truth was considerably more complex. My phone displayed the final confirmation from Sterling Capital Management, the private equity firm I had inherited from my grandmother 2 years ago. The transaction was complete. I now owned the building that housed Bistro Lumière, the restaurant's business license, all its equipment, and the contracts of every employee, currently discussing my professional inadequacies in the next room. 4 months ago, when I first learned that Harold Blackstone was looking to sell the restaurant, I had my lawyers approach him through a shell company. The process had been delicate. I needed to acquire the business without arousing suspicion from my co-workers who thought I was just another struggling server saving for culinary school. The irony was rich. While Brandon, Kimber, and Austin had been plotting my professional downfall, I had been systematically purchasing their workplace. Victoria? I looked up to see Taylor Kim, one of the newer servers, standing in the doorway. She was the only co-worker who had consistently treated me with genuine respect and friendship. The staff meeting is about to start. Brandon sent me to find you. I stood and smoothed my simple black dress, another carefully chosen piece that appeared modest but was actually designer. Thank you, Taylor. I'll be right there. As we walked toward the private dining room, Taylor lowered her voice. Victoria, I wanted to give you a heads up. I overheard Brandon talking to Kimber earlier, and I think they're planning to announce some changes that might affect you. I looked at her with genuine appreciation. In a workplace full of people who had underestimated me, Taylor had always seen my actual contributions. Thank you for the warning. That's very thoughtful of you. I just think what they've been doing lately is unfair. You've been here longer than most of us, and you work harder than anyone. As we reached the dining room, I placed my hand gently on Taylor's arm. Don't worry about me. I have a feeling everything is about to change for the better. The door opened, and Brandon gestured for us to enter. There you are, Victoria. We were just about to start. I took my seat at the table, directly across from Harold Blackstone, and waited for the performance to begin. Harold Blackstone cleared his throat and looked around the table with the practiced gravity of someone about to deliver life-changing news. The amusing part was that he had no idea how accurate that assessment would be. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for gathering this morning. I have some important announcements about the future of Bistro Lumière. I folded my hands in my lap and maintained a pleasant, attentive expression while calculating how long it would take me to implement the changes I'd been planning. As you know, our industry is increasingly competitive. To maintain our position as one of the premier dining establishments in the city, we need strong leadership and fresh vision. Brandon leaned forward slightly, his posture radiating confidence. He clearly believed this meeting would cement his role as Harold's right-hand man. Therefore, I'm pleased to announce that Kimber Stone will be promoted to assistant manager, effective immediately. Applause rippled around the table. Kimber beamed, accepting congratulations from our colleagues. I clapped politely, my face betraying nothing of what I was thinking. Harold continued. Brandon will take on expanded responsibilities as general manager, and we'll be restructuring some positions to better align with our growth strategy. The restructuring, I knew from my preliminary review of employee files, would involve reducing my hours and responsibilities. They planned to slowly phase me out while avoiding the expense and legal complications of termination. Victoria, Harold said, turning his attention to me, we'll be adjusting your role to focus on table service and customer relations areas where your gentle disposition will be most valuable. Austin smirked. Perfect fit for her skill set. I nodded graciously. That sounds lovely. I appreciate you thinking of ways to utilize my strengths. Brandon looked slightly surprised by my calm acceptance. He had probably expected tears, protests, or at least disappointment. Instead, I was giving him the serene smile I used with difficult customers. Excellent attitude, Victoria. This is exactly the kind of team spirit that makes transitions smooth. Harold began discussing timeline details, budget allocations, and expansion plans. As he spoke, I mentally reviewed the employee handbook I now had the authority to revise. The irony of their exclusion strategy was about to become deliciously apparent. My phone buzzed quietly with another text from my attorney. Building inspection complete. Restaurant license transfer processed. You can take possession whenever you're ready. I typed back. Monday morning. Prepare termination paperwork for specific employees. I'll send the list tonight. Harold finished his presentation and invited questions. Several hands shot up around the table, but I remained silent, still smiling serenely. Victoria, any thoughts about the changes? Brandon asked, perhaps testing whether my composure would crack under direct attention. I looked around the table at the faces of people who had systematically undervalued my contributions and excluded me from advancement opportunities. Actually, I do have something to share, but I think it might be better saved for Monday morning. The weekend passed slowly as I finalized arrangements with my management team from Sterling Capital. We had acquired 17 restaurants over the past 2 years, but none of the transactions had been as personally satisfying as this one. Victoria, are you certain you want to handle the transition this way? Asked Patricia Wells, my lead attorney. We were sitting in my penthouse apartment, reviewing personnel files and restructuring plans. I'm certain. They made their choice to exclude me based on assumptions about my capabilities and connections. I'm simply providing them with new information about both. Patricia smiled wryly. It's certainly poetic justice, though I hope you're prepared for the emotional aftermath of essentially firing most of your colleagues. I walked to my floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the city where I had spent 3 years pretending to be someone I wasn't. The view from the 42nd floor always helped me maintain perspective. Patricia, these people didn't exclude me because of my work performance. They excluded me because they assumed I was powerless and disposable. That's not a mistake, it's a character assessment. And Taylor Kim? I had spent considerable time thinking about Taylor's future. She was the only employee who had consistently treated me with respect and fairness. Taylor gets promoted to assistant manager. She's earned it through merit, not politics. My phone rang, interrupting our planning session. The caller ID showed Brandon Walsh. Hello, Brandon. Hey, Victoria. I hope you don't mind me calling on a Sunday. I wanted to touch base about tomorrow's schedule. With Kimber transitioning into her new role, we'll need you to cover some additional tables. I almost laughed. Even now, they assumed I would simply accept whatever arrangement suited their convenience. Of course, I'll be there bright and early Monday morning. Great attitude. I know Friday's meeting was a lot of changes, but I think you'll find that your new responsibilities suit you perfectly. I'm sure they will. See you tomorrow, Brandon. After I hung up, Patricia looked at me with raised eyebrows. Still playing the role? Until 9 a.m. tomorrow, then the performance ends. That evening, I called Taylor to inform her that she wouldn't need to come in until noon on Monday. I told her there would be some administrative meetings in the morning that wouldn't require her presence. Is everything okay? She asked. You sound different. Everything is perfect, Taylor. I just wanted to make sure you have a relaxing morning before what's going to be a very interesting day. Monday morning, I arrived at Bistro Lumière at 8:30, wearing a charcoal grey business suit that none of my coworkers had ever seen. The transformation from my usual simple server attire was deliberate and dramatic. Brandon was already in the office, reviewing weekend receipts. He looked up as I knocked on the door frame, and his expression shifted from casual greeting to confusion. "Victoria, you look different today." "Good morning, Brandon." "Yes, I thought it was time for a change." Kimber appeared behind me, stopping short when she saw my appearance. "Wow, Victoria, job interview somewhere?" I smiled, the same serene smile I had perfected over 3 years of service. Something like that. At exactly 9 o'clock, Patricia Wells entered the restaurant with 2 other attorneys and a security consultant. The legal team was impressive, sharply dressed, professionally confident, and carrying briefcases that suggested serious business. Brandon emerged from the office, clearly confused by the presence of lawyers in his restaurant during off hours. "Excuse me, we're not open yet. Can I help you with something?" Patricia stepped forward with practiced authority. "Mr. Walsh, I'm Patricia Wells, representing the new ownership of this establishment. We're here to meet with current management about transition procedures." The color drained from Brandon's face. New ownership? Mr. Blackstone didn't mention anything about selling the restaurant. The transaction was completed Friday evening, Patricia replied smoothly. "All documentation has been properly filed with the City Business License Office." Austin emerged from the kitchen, followed by Kimber and several other morning staff members. They formed a small cluster near the bar, whispering among themselves as they tried to process what was happening. "I don't understand," Kimber said, her voice taking on an edge of panic. "Who bought the restaurant?" Patricia gestured toward me. "Allow me to introduce Victoria Sterling, CEO of Sterling Capital Management and your new owner." The silence in the room was profound. I watched as my former colleagues processed the information, their expressions shifting from confusion to shock, to something approaching horror. Brandon found his voice first. "Victoria? That's impossible. You're a server. Actually, I've been conducting a 3-year comprehensive analysis of restaurant operations, staff management, and customer service protocols," I replied calmly. "It's been quite educational." The security consultant stepped forward with a tablet and began photographing employee identification badges and reviewing personnel files. The systematic documentation was clearly rattling my former colleagues, who were beginning to understand that this wasn't a casual business transaction. "Victoria," Austin said, his voice tight with disbelief. "What the hell is going on here?" I looked around the dining room that I had served, cleaned, and helped maintain for 3 years, while my coworkers underestimated my capabilities and excluded me from advancement. "What's going on, Austin, is that you're all about to learn the consequences of systematically undervaluing someone based on assumptions rather than evidence." Patricia opened her briefcase and removed a stack of documents. "We have termination paperwork for Brandon Walsh, Kimber Stone, Austin Hayes, and several other employees whose performance reviews indicate patterns of unprofessional conduct." Brandon stepped toward me, his face flushed with anger and panic. "You can't do this. We have contracts, employment agreements, at-will employment." "Actually," I interrupted gently, which means either party can terminate the working relationship at any time for any reason that doesn't violate anti-discrimination laws. This is revenge, Kimber accused, her voice rising. You're firing us because we got promoted instead of you. I considered her accusation carefully. Kimber, you're partially correct. I am firing you. But not because you got promoted, because of how you discussed my capabilities when you thought I couldn't hear you. I pulled out my phone and played the recording I had made Friday morning outside the private dining room. Their voices filled the restaurant, discussing my supposed inadequacies and lack of leadership potential. The color drained from Kimber's face as she heard her own words. She's always been too quiet, too passive. Not restaurant management material. You recorded us? Brandon demanded. I documented a conversation that occurred in a semi-public space of my workplace, I corrected. Which, incidentally, is perfectly legal in this state. Patricia continued distributing termination papers. You'll find that severance packages are included, along with positive references that focus on your technical skills rather than your judgment. I watched Austin review his termination documents, his hands shaking slightly as he realized the magnitude of what was happening. Victoria, I know we haven't always been supportive, but this seems extreme. Austin, 3 days ago, you told the restaurant owner that I lacked the vision and connections to help transform this establishment. Today, you're discovering that I had the vision to buy it entirely and the connections to complete the transaction in 4 months. The security consultant finished his documentation and nodded to Patricia. All employee access codes have been updated. New keys will be provided to authorized personnel only. Harold Blackstone chose that moment to walk through the front door, apparently unaware of the drama unfolding in his former restaurant. His confident smile faltered as he took in the scene, lawyers, security personnel, and his former employees looking shell-shocked. "What's all this about?" he asked, approaching Patricia with confusion. "Mr. Blackstone, thank you for joining us. I believe you have some final paperwork to sign. Transferring the business accounts and vendor relationships?" Harold looked around the room, finally focusing on me with growing recognition. "Victoria, you're the buyer? Sterling Capital Management? Hello, Mr. Blackstone. Yes, it's been an interesting morning." He stared at me for a long moment, clearly trying to reconcile the quiet server he thought he knew with the woman who had just purchased his restaurant. "But you work here. You're an employee." "I was conducting field research," I replied. "I wanted to understand restaurant operations from the ground level before acquiring properties in this sector." Harold's business instincts kicked in, and he began laughing, a rich, appreciative sound that filled the tense atmosphere. "Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. You spent 3 years learning every aspect of the operation before buying it." Brandon stepped forward desperately. "Mr. Blackstone, surely you can explain to Victoria that this is unnecessary. We can work out whatever misunderstanding, Brandon," Harold interrupted. "There's no misunderstanding. Miss Sterling bought the restaurant fair and square. If she wants to make personnel changes, that's her prerogative as the new owner." The finality in his voice seemed to break something in Brandon's composure. "This is insane. You can't just fire half your staff because your feelings were hurt." I looked at him with the same serene expression I had maintained throughout this confrontation. Brandon, I'm not firing you because my feelings were hurt. I'm firing you because you demonstrated that you make important decisions based on assumptions rather than evidence. That's not a management style I want in my restaurant. Patricia began collecting the signed termination documents. Former employees have until noon to remove personal items from the premises. Security will escort you during the process. As my former colleagues began to understand that this was really happening, that their comfortable assumptions about workplace hierarchy had been completely overturned, I felt something I hadn't expected: peace. For 3 years, I had watched these people treat me as dispensable, while I quietly built the power to make them dispensable instead. The justice was poetic, but more importantly, it was thorough. Taylor arrived at noon, as I had requested, walking into a restaurant that was quieter and more tense than she had ever experienced. She looked around at the missing faces and the presence of legal representatives with growing concern. "Victoria, what happened here?" I gestured for her to join me at a corner table where I was reviewing staffing plans with Patricia. "Taylor, please sit down. I have some things to explain." She took the seat across from me, her eyes wide with worry. "Is the restaurant closing? Did something happen to Mr. Blackstone?" "The restaurant is not closing, and Mr. Blackstone is fine. He sold the business to new ownership." "Who bought it?" I slid a business card across the table. "Victoria Sterling, CEO, Sterling Capital Management." Taylor stared at the card, then at me, then back at the card. "Victoria, I don't understand. This is your name." "Yes. I bought the restaurant Friday evening. I've been planning this acquisition for 4 months. The silence stretched between us as Taylor processed the information. Unlike my other colleagues, she didn't immediately jump to accusations or anger. Instead, she asked the question I had been hoping someone would ask. "Why?" I leaned back in my chair, choosing my words carefully. "Because I wanted to understand whether the people I worked with would value competence and character, or whether they would make decisions based on assumptions and politics." "And what did you discover?" "That most of them chose assumptions and politics. But you didn't." I slid a second document across the table, an offer letter for the position of assistant manager, with a salary that was triple what she had been making as a server. Taylor read the offer twice before looking up at me with tears in her eyes. "Victoria, I don't know what to say. Say you'll help me rebuild this restaurant into something better than it was. Say you'll help me create a workplace where people are valued for their contributions, not dismissed based on superficial judgments." What happened to the others? Brandon? Kimber? Austin? I explained the morning's events, the recorded conversation, and the termination process. Taylor listened without judgment, occasionally nodding as pieces of workplace dynamics she had observed began making sense. "I always wondered why you seemed so calm about being overlooked for promotions," she said finally. "Now I understand you weren't overlooked. You were planning." "Exactly." Patricia gathered her paperwork and prepared to leave. "Victoria, I'll have the employment contracts ready for your review by tomorrow morning. The transition should be complete by the end of the week." As my attorney departed, Taylor and I sat in the empty restaurant, planning its future. "What's your vision for this place?" she asked. I looked around at the dining room where I had spent 3 years being underestimated, excluded, and dismissed by people who never bothered to learn who I really was. Excellence, integrity, a place where the best ideas win, regardless of who suggests them. Over the next 2 weeks, I hired 12 new employees, restructured the management hierarchy, and implemented operational changes I had been observing the need for during my 3 years of field research. The restaurant reopened with a staff that was more diverse, more competent, and significantly more respectful than the previous team. Taylor thrived in her new role as assistant manager, bringing the same fairness and competence to leadership that she had shown as a server. Watching her coordinate staff schedules and training programs confirmed that I had made the right choice in promoting her. "Victoria," she said one afternoon, as we reviewed customer feedback surveys, "I have a confession to make." "What's that?" "I always suspected there was more to you than you let on. You knew too much about restaurant operations, you handled difficult customers too smoothly, and you never seemed stressed about money the way the rest of us were." I smiled. "What gave it away?" "Your shoes. They looked simple. But I recognized the brand. I spent a summer working at a high-end boutique in college. Nobody wears $1,000 shoes to serve tables unless they have a very good reason. It was a detail I hadn't considered carefully enough, but I was glad Taylor had been observant rather than resentful. "Would you have treated me differently if you had known?" She considered the question seriously. "I don't think so. I was raised to judge people by their character, not their bank account. But it does explain why you never complained about difficult customers or unreasonable managers. It's easier to maintain perspective when you know the situation is temporary." That afternoon, I received an unexpected phone call from Kimber Stone. "Victoria, I know I probably have no right to call you, but I wanted to apologize." I was surprised by the sincerity in her voice. "What prompted this, Kimber?" "I've been thinking about what happened, about the things I said, and I realized that you were right. I made assumptions about you based on very little evidence." I walked to my office window, looking down at the street where people hurried past without knowing the stories unfolding in the buildings around them. "I appreciate you calling, Kimber. That takes courage. I wanted you to know that I understand why you fired me. I also wanted to ask, do you think there's any chance I could work for you again?" The question surprised me. "Why would you want to?" "Because watching you handle that transition taught me something about leadership that I hadn't understood before. You were calm, fair, and decisive. Even when you were firing me, you provided severance and positive references." I considered her request. "Kimber, you're talented and hardworking, but you also demonstrated a willingness to exclude and diminish colleagues based on assumptions. How do I know that pattern wouldn't continue?" "You don't, but I'm hoping you'd be willing to give me a chance to prove I can do better." 3 months after the acquisition, Bistro Lumière had transformed into exactly what I had envisioned. Customer satisfaction scores had improved dramatically. Staff turnover had dropped to nearly 0, and we were consistently booked weeks in advance. The local food critics had noticed the changes. Under new ownership, Bistro Lumière has evolved from a competent neighborhood restaurant to a dining destination that rivals the city's finest establishments, wrote the Times food columnist. I was reviewing the evening's reservations when Patricia Wells called with an update on my former colleagues. I thought you'd be interested to know that Brandon Walsh is working as a server at a chain restaurant across town. Austin Hayes found a position as a prep cook at a hotel restaurant. And Kimber Stone has been asking mutual acquaintances for your contact information. How are they doing? Mixed results. Brandon seems to be struggling with the adjustment to a less prestigious position. Austin appears to be doing well. His new chef speaks highly of his skills. And Kimber has been taking management courses at the community college. I had been thinking about Kimber's phone call and her request for a second chance. Part of me believed that people could learn and grow from their mistakes. Another part of me wondered whether trust, once broken, could ever be fully repaired. Patricia, what's your professional opinion about rehiring former employees who demonstrated poor judgment? Legally, you have every right to refuse. Practically, it depends on whether you believe the person has actually changed rather than just being desperate for employment. That evening, I had dinner with Taylor to discuss restaurant operations and future planning. She had proven to be an exceptional assistant manager, and I was considering promoting her to general manager. Taylor, I want to ask your opinion about something. Kimber Stone has asked about coming back to work here. Taylor's eyebrows rose. Really? What are you thinking? I'm thinking that people deserve opportunities to learn from their mistakes. But I'm also thinking that some mistakes reveal character flaws that don't change easily. What did she say when she called? I recounted Kimber's apology and her explanation of what she had learned from the experience. Taylor was quiet for several minutes. Victoria, you taught me that leadership means making decisions based on evidence rather than assumptions. What evidence do you have about whether Kimber has actually changed? It was an excellent question, and it reminded me why I had promoted Taylor in the first place. The management courses she's taking, her willingness to apologize and acknowledge her mistakes, and the fact that she's asking for a chance rather than demanding it. But I also have evidence of her willingness to exclude colleagues and make decisions based on prejudice rather than merit. So the question is, which pattern is more likely to predict her future behavior? I decided to conduct an experiment. I called Kimber and offered her a trial position, not as a server, but as a hostess, where I could observe her interactions with customers and staff without giving her significant authority. Really? You'd be willing to give me another chance? A trial run, I corrected. 1 month. Part-time hours, with the understanding that your employment depends entirely on your performance and attitude. I accept. Thank you, Victoria. I won't disappoint you. On Kimber's first day back, I watched carefully as she interacted with our new staff members. She was polite, professional, and notably humble, a marked change from her previous confidence that had bordered on arrogance. Taylor observed her interactions as well. She seems different, she noted, more thoughtful about how she speaks to people. Time will tell whether it's genuine change or just good acting. 2 weeks into Kimber's trial period, we had our first real test of her growth. A difficult customer became verbally abusive toward one of our newer servers, demanding to speak to management and making personal attacks about the server's competence. I watched from my office as Kimber handled the situation. She remained calm, professional, and supportive of our employee while finding a way to de-escalate the customer's anger. Most importantly, she didn't throw the server under the bus to appease the customer, something the old Kimber might have done. After the incident, I pulled her aside. That was well handled, Kimber. What was your thinking in that situation? I remembered what you said about judging people by their character rather than their position. Our server made a minor mistake, but she's been working hard and learning quickly. The customer was using his position to bully someone who couldn't fight back. And how does that compare to how you might have handled it 3 months ago? She looked uncomfortable, but answered honestly. 3 months ago, I probably would have sided with the customer to avoid conflict, even if he was wrong. I would have prioritized keeping him happy over protecting our employee. What changed your perspective? Getting fired changed my perspective. Realizing that I had been making judgments about people without really knowing them or considering their circumstances, I was beginning to believe that Kimber's transformation might be genuine. But I wanted one more test. Kimber, I'm going to ask you a difficult question, and I want you to be completely honest. Okay, if you discovered that a coworker was struggling financially and taking home leftover food without permission, what would you do? She thought carefully before answering. I would talk to the person privately first to understand their situation and see if we could find a better solution. Maybe employee meal programs or scheduling adjustments that would help them earn more. And if that didn't resolve the issue, then I'd bring it to your attention, but with recommendations for how to help the person rather than just reporting them for violation. It was exactly the answer I had hoped to hear. At the end of Kimber's trial month, I offered her a permanent position as head of customer relations, a new role I had created that focused on training staff in customer service excellence and conflict resolution. I'm creating this position because I believe the restaurant industry needs people who understand how to balance customer satisfaction with employee dignity, I explained. Your experience being on both sides of workplace power dynamics gives you unique insights. Kimber accepted the position with tears in her eyes. Victoria, I know I don't deserve this second chance, but I'm grateful for it. I promise I'll use what I learned from my mistakes to help others. 6 months after acquiring Bistro Lumière, I received a call from Harold Blackstone. Victoria, I've been following the restaurant's progress, and I have to say, I'm impressed. You've accomplished more in 6 months than I managed in 5 years of ownership. Thank you, Harold. That means a great deal coming from you. I'm calling because I have a business proposition. I'm opening a new restaurant group, and I'd like you to consider partnering with me. Not as an employee, as an equal partner. The irony was rich. The same man who had agreed that I lacked the vision and connections for assistant manager was now offering me a partnership in a larger enterprise. I'm flattered by the offer, Harold. What makes you think I'd be interested in expanding? Because you turned a good restaurant into an exceptional one by focusing on people rather than just profits. The industry needs more leaders who understand that success comes from empowering employees, not exploiting them. I told him I would consider his proposal, but honestly, I was more interested in perfecting what we had built at Bistro Lumière than expanding into new ventures. That evening, I had dinner at my own restaurant, sitting at a corner table where I could observe the operation I had spent 4 years building, 3 as an undercover employee and 1 as an owner. Taylor approached my table during a quiet moment. "How does it feel watching all of this?" "Like justice," I replied. "Not revenge justice. What's the difference? Revenge is about making people suffer. Justice is about creating systems that reward merit and character over politics and assumptions." I looked around the dining room, filled with happy customers being served by staff members who were valued, respected, and fairly compensated for their contributions. The people who excluded me taught me exactly what kind of leader I didn't want to be. In a strange way, I should thank them. Are you happy with how it all turned out? I'm satisfied. The restaurant is successful, the staff is thriving, and I've proven that competence and integrity can triumph over workplace politics. But I've learned that the most important victory isn't defeating people who underestimated you, it's building something so excellent that their opinions become irrelevant. A year after the acquisition, Bistro Lumière was featured on the cover of Restaurant Business magazine with the headline, "From Server to CEO, a Masterclass in Strategic Patience." The article detailed my 3-year undercover study of restaurant operations and the dramatic transformation that followed my acquisition of the business. The feature brought unexpected attention, including speaking requests from business schools and hospitality industry conferences. Apparently, my story resonated with people who had felt undervalued in their workplaces. "Victoria," Taylor said as we reviewed the media requests, "you could build an entire consulting business around what you learned during your 3 years as an employee." She was right. I had insights into restaurant operations from the ground level that most owners never acquired. More importantly, I had developed systems for identifying and developing talent that was being overlooked by traditional management hierarchies. "Would you be interested in helping me expand that concept?" I asked. "Not franchising restaurants, but consulting with existing establishments about operational excellence and staff development." Taylor's eyes lit up. "You mean help other restaurants figure out how to value their employees properly?" "Exactly. Turn our experience here into a model that could improve the industry more broadly." We spent the next month developing a consulting framework based on our transformation of Bistro Lumière. The core principles were simple. Observe before judging, promote based on merit rather than assumptions, and create systems where the best ideas win regardless of who suggests them. Our first consulting client was Harold Blackstone, who hired us to assess staff dynamics at his new restaurant venture. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man who had once agreed that I lacked leadership vision was now paying me to share that vision with his organization. "Victoria," he said as we concluded our initial assessment, "I owe you an apology. Not for selling you the restaurant that was the best business decision I ever made, but for failing to recognize your capabilities when you worked for me. Harold, you saw what I wanted you to see. I was deliberately presenting myself as an unremarkable employee. But a good leader should have looked deeper, should have recognized that someone who handled difficult customers as smoothly as you did probably had management potential. Maybe you were operating within a system that trained you to make quick judgments based on surface observations. The real question is whether you've learned to look deeper now. His new restaurant was struggling with high staff turnover and low customer satisfaction scores, problems that were all too familiar from my early observations of Bistro Lumière. After our week-long assessment, Taylor and I presented our recommendations to Harold and his management team. The core issues were predictable: talented employees being overlooked for advancement, management decisions based on politics rather than performance, and a culture that rewarded compliance over innovation. The solution isn't complicated, I explained to his team. You need to create systems that identify and develop talent instead of systems that maintain existing hierarchies. How do we do that? Asked his general manager. Start by asking your employees what they observe about your operations. The people doing the daily work often have the best insights about efficiency improvements and customer service innovations. Over the next 2 years, our consulting business grew to include 15 restaurants across 3 states. Each engagement reinforced the lessons I had learned during my time as an undercover employee. Most workplace problems stemmed from leadership that made assumptions rather than gathering evidence. Taylor proved to be an exceptional consultant, bringing the same fairness and insight to client relationships that she had shown at Bistro Lumière. Together, we developed assessment tools that helped restaurant owners identify talented employees who were being overlooked by traditional promotion systems. You know what's interesting? Taylor said as we reviewed client feedback. Almost every restaurant we've worked with has at least one employee who reminds me of you during your server days. Competent, observant, undervalued. And what happens when we help management recognize their potential? The restaurants become more successful and those employees become leaders. It's like we're multiplying the impact of your original experiment. My phone rang, interrupting our planning session. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. Victoria Sterling. Miss Sterling, this is Austin Hayes. I'm not sure if you remember me. Of course I remember you, Austin. How are you doing? I'm doing well, actually. I'm calling because I heard about your consulting business, and I wanted to ask if you'd consider having coffee with me. I was curious about his motivation for reaching out. What would you like to discuss? I've been thinking a lot about what happened at Bistro Lumière, about the mistakes I made in how I judged you and treated you. I'd like to apologize properly, and I'd also like to ask your advice about something. We met the following week at a cafe across town. Austin looked healthier and more relaxed than he had during his final weeks at the restaurant. Victoria, I want to start by acknowledging that I was wrong about you. I made assumptions about your capabilities based on superficial observations, and I participated in discussions that were unfair and unprofessional. I appreciate that acknowledgement, Austin. I also want you to know that getting fired from Bistro Lumière was the best thing that ever happened to my career. I was surprised by this perspective. How so? Because it forced me to examine my own attitudes about leadership and teamwork. I realized I had been operating under the assumption that being loud and confident made me a leader, when actually it just made me someone who talked over better ideas. He explained that his new position had taught him to listen more carefully to colleagues and to evaluate ideas based on merit rather than who suggested them. What advice were you hoping to get? I asked. I'm being considered for a sous chef position at a high-end establishment, but the head chef wants to know that I can manage kitchen staff effectively. I was hoping you could help me understand what real leadership looks like. What do you think real leadership looks like based on your experience over the past 2 years? Creating an environment where people can do their best work. Recognizing good ideas regardless of who suggests them. And making decisions based on evidence rather than assumptions. It was exactly the answer I would have hoped for. I spent an hour with Austin, sharing insights about leadership that I had learned through my transition from excluded employee to business owner. He was attentive, thoughtful, and genuinely committed to applying what he learned. Austin, you seem to have gained a lot of wisdom from your experience. That suggests you'll be an effective leader in your new role. Thank you. And Victoria? Yes? I hope you know that what you did buying the restaurant, exposing our behavior, rebuilding the culture, it wasn't just about getting revenge. You showed all of us what we could become if we operated with integrity and fairness. As I drove home from our meeting, I reflected on the unexpected ways my story had influenced the people who had originally excluded me. Austin had become more thoughtful. Kimber had developed empathy and humility, and even Brandon had reportedly been humbled by his experience of being powerless in workplace dynamics. The transformation of Bistro Lumière had become something larger than I had originally envisioned, not just a successful restaurant, but a model for how workplace culture could be rebuilt around merit and respect. That evening, I had dinner with Taylor to discuss our consulting business's future direction. Victoria, I've been thinking about expanding our model beyond restaurants, hotels, retail, corporate offices, any workplace where talented people are being overlooked because of systemic biases. That's ambitious. Do you think our restaurant-based insights would translate to other industries? I think the core principles would translate perfectly. People are underestimated in every industry, usually for the same reasons: assumptions about class, education, appearance, or communication style. She was right. My experience of being dismissed as too quiet and lacking leadership potential was common across many workplaces where extroversion was mistaken for competence and compliance was valued over innovation. What would that expansion look like? We could develop assessment tools that help organizations identify hidden talent. We could provide training for managers about recognizing different types of intelligence and leadership potential. And we could create mentorship programs that help overlooked employees develop their capabilities. As Taylor outlined her vision, I realized that my revenge on 4 colleagues who had excluded me had evolved into something much more meaningful. A systematic approach to transforming workplace culture across multiple industries. 6 months later, we launched Sterling Leadership Consulting with a mission statement that reflected our core philosophy: identifying and developing talent that traditional systems overlook. Our first non-restaurant client was a law firm struggling with associate retention. The partners couldn't understand why their most promising young lawyers kept leaving for competitors. After 2 weeks of assessment, the problem was obvious. The firm's promotion system favored associates who matched the partners' personal styles rather than those who demonstrated the best legal skills or client service abilities. You're promoting people who remind you of yourselves, I explained to the senior partners, rather than people who complement your capabilities or bring fresh perspectives. But we need associates who can represent our firm's culture and values, protested one partner. Your culture should be excellence and client service, Taylor replied. Everything else is just personal preference. The law firm engagement was successful enough that word spread through the professional community about our unconventional approach to talent development. Within a year, we were working with clients ranging from tech startups to medical practices, helping them identify and promote employees who had been overlooked by traditional advancement systems. Each client engagement reinforced the lessons I had learned during my 3 years as an undercover employee. Most organizations had talented people whose capabilities weren't being recognized or utilized effectively. Victoria, Taylor said as we reviewed our client roster, do you ever think about writing a book about what we've learned? A practical guide for employees who feel undervalued and managers who want to identify hidden talent. Your story could be the framework, but the real value would be the systems we've developed. I had been thinking about a similar project. Our consulting work had generated insights about workplace dynamics that could help both employees and managers navigate complex professional relationships more effectively. What would we call it? Something like the underestimated advantage: how hidden talent transforms organizations. We spent the next year writing and researching, interviewing clients and employees who had benefited from our consulting programs. The book became both a personal memoir of my journey from excluded employee to business owner and a practical guide for recognizing and developing overlooked talent. The publication process brought unexpected media attention. I was invited to speak at conferences, business schools, and corporate leadership retreats about the strategic value of identifying hidden capabilities within existing teams. Miss Sterling asked an audience member at a Harvard Business School event, "What advice would you give to employees who feel their talents aren't being recognized by management?" "Document everything," I replied. "Track your contributions, ideas, and achievements. Build relationships with colleagues who do recognize your value. And most importantly, develop your capabilities whether or not you're being promoted, because competence always finds a way to surface." And for managers who want to avoid missing talented employees, ask better questions. Instead of looking for people who remind you of yourselves, look for people who solve problems effectively, generate good ideas, and treat colleagues with respect. Those are the qualities that drive organizational success. After the presentation, a young woman approached me with a familiar story. "Miss Sterling, I'm a financial analyst at a consulting firm, and I think my situation is similar to what you experienced. I've been consistently passed over for advancement while less qualified colleagues get promoted. What evidence do you have about the quality of your work compared to theirs? I've been keeping detailed records of project outcomes, client feedback, and the accuracy of my analyses. My work consistently outperforms my colleagues, but I keep being told I need to be more assertive and visible." Translation: they want you to be more like the people who are already in leadership, rather than recognizing that different leadership styles can be equally effective. I spent 30 minutes with her, sharing strategies for protecting her work, building alliances with fair-minded colleagues, and developing evidence-based arguments for advancement. The most important thing, I told her, is to remember that being underestimated is temporary if you're willing to be strategic about changing your circumstances. 3 years after acquiring Bistro Lumière, I received an invitation that completed the circle of my journey in an unexpected way. The city's restaurant association wanted to honor me with their Entrepreneur of the Year award for transforming the hospitality industry's approach to employee development. The award ceremony was held at the grand ballroom of the same hotel where I had first met with my lawyers to plan the restaurant acquisition. As I sat at the head table, looking out at an audience of restaurant owners and hospitality professionals, I thought about how dramatically my life had changed since that morning when I overheard my colleagues planning my professional exclusion. "Ladies and gentlemen," the presenter announced, "this year's Entrepreneur of the Year award recognizes someone who has revolutionized not just her own business, but our entire industry's understanding of talent development and employee engagement." The irony wasn't lost on me. 3 years ago, I had been deemed unqualified for assistant manager. Tonight, I was being recognized as an industry leader whose innovations were being copied by restaurants across the country. Victoria Sterling transformed a struggling restaurant into a model of operational excellence by implementing a simple but radical concept that the best ideas should win, regardless of who suggests them. As I walked to the podium to accept the award, I spotted several familiar faces in the audience. Harold Blackstone was there, beaming with pride at the success of his former employee turned industry leader. Taylor sat at our company table representing the management team that had grown from 2 people to 25. And in the back of the room, I was surprised to see Austin Hayes, now executive chef at a prestigious downtown restaurant, applauding along with the rest of the audience. "Thank you for this honor," I began, looking out at the crowd of hospitality professionals. 3 years ago, I was working as a server, watching talented colleagues being overlooked for advancement because they didn't fit traditional leadership stereotypes. I could see people leaning forward, interested in the personal story behind the business success. I learned that most workplace problems aren't about lack of talent. They're about systems that fail to recognize and develop the talent that already exists. I explained how our consulting approach had helped dozens of restaurants improve both employee satisfaction and customer experience by creating advancement systems based on merit rather than assumptions. The restaurant industry has always been hierarchical, with advancement depending more on confidence and connections than on competence and character. But we've proven that organizations perform better when they identify and develop hidden talent rather than promoting people who simply remind leadership of themselves. The applause was thunderous. After the ceremony, I was surrounded by restaurant owners who wanted to learn more about our talent development systems. "Victoria," said one owner, "my restaurant has the same problems you described. High turnover, low morale, talented servers who never get promoted. How do we start changing that?" Start by asking your employees what they observe about your operations. The people doing the daily work often have the best insights about improvement opportunities. Another owner asked, How do we identify employees with management potential who might not be obvious candidates? Look for people who solve problems without being asked, who treat difficult customers with patience and professionalism, and who help colleagues succeed rather than competing with them. 6 months after receiving the Entrepreneur of the Year award, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I announced that I was selling Bistro Lumière to Taylor and transitioning to full-time consulting and speaking about workplace transformation. "Victoria, are you sure about this?" Taylor asked when I shared my plans. "The restaurant is more successful than ever. That's exactly why it's time to move on." Bistro Lumière has become everything I envisioned. A model workplace where talent is recognized and developed fairly. Now, I want to help other organizations achieve the same transformation. But selling it to me? I can't afford, Taylor. You've been the co-architect of everything we've built here. The restaurant's success is as much yours as mine. I'm offering you a purchase plan that reflects your contributions to its value. The terms I offered Taylor were generous but fair. A 10-year payment plan with interest rates below market value, structured so that the restaurant's profits would cover the acquisition costs while still providing her with a substantial salary increase. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, tears in her eyes. "Because this is what recognition and advancement based on merit looks like. You've earned the opportunity to own and lead this business." The transition took 6 months to complete. During that time, I trained Taylor on the financial and legal aspects of restaurant ownership while she prepared to take over full operational control. "Are you nervous about running the restaurant without me?" I asked during one of our final planning sessions. "A little, but I think I understand the core principles well enough to maintain what we've built and continue improving it, which are: hire for character and competence, promote based on evidence rather than assumptions, and create systems where the best ideas win regardless of who suggests them." On my last official day as owner of Bistro Lumière, the staff threw a farewell party that was both celebratory and bittersweet. I had spent 4 years there, 3 as an undercover employee and 1 as the owner who transformed its culture. Speech. Called out one of the servers I had hired during the renovation. I looked around the dining room filled with employees who had been chosen for their talent rather than their ability to fit traditional stereotypes, working in an environment where their contributions were valued and their potential was developed. 4 years ago, I started working here as a server, I began. I wanted to understand restaurant operations from the ground up, but I also wanted to see whether talented people would be recognized and advanced based on their merit. I glanced at Taylor, who was beaming with pride and anticipation about her new role as owner. What I discovered was that most workplace problems aren't about lack of talent, they're about systems that fail to identify and develop the talent that already exists. I explained how their restaurant had become a model for the hospitality industry, how their success had influenced policies at dozens of other establishments, and how their individual stories of advancement and growth had inspired the consulting work that was now my primary focus. The most important lesson I learned here is that being underestimated is only temporary if you're willing to be strategic about demonstrating your true capabilities. As the evening wound down, I realized that my journey from excluded employee to industry leader was complete. But the impact would continue through the people and systems I was leaving behind. 2 years after selling Bistro Lumière, my consulting business had expanded to include Fortune 500 companies, government agencies, and international corporations. The principles we had developed in restaurant settings proved to be universally applicable to any organization struggling with talent retention and employee engagement. "Victoria," my assistant announced, "you have a call from a documentary filmmaker who wants to discuss a project about workplace transformation." The filmmaker, Ana Rodriguez, had been following our work for several months and wanted to create a feature-length documentary about the journey from my exclusion at Bistro Lumière to the national consulting business that had grown from that experience. "What interests you most about this story?" I asked during our initial conversation. "The strategic patience," she replied. "Most people who face workplace exclusion either quit or confront their colleagues directly. You chose a third option, building the power to change the entire system." Over the next 6 months, Anna and her team documented our consulting work, interviewed employees whose careers had been transformed by our programs, and captured the ongoing success of Bistro Lumière under Taylor's ownership. The most powerful interview was with Kimber Stone, who had become one of our most effective consulting associates after proving herself during her trial period at the restaurant. "Victoria taught me that leadership isn't about being the loudest voice in the room," Kimber said to Anna's cameras. "It's about creating environments where everyone's best ideas can surface and be implemented." "Do you think she planned your professional development from the beginning?" Anna asked. "I think she planned to give people opportunities to reveal their true character, both the flaws and the potential for growth. What we did with those opportunities was up to us." The documentary, titled The Underestimated Advantage, premiered at the Sundance Film Festival and was subsequently acquired by a major streaming service. The response was overwhelming. Business schools added it to their curricula, and corporations began requesting screenings for their leadership teams. "Victoria, Taylor called me after the premiere. Have you seen the online response? People are sharing their own stories of being underestimated at work and using your strategies to change their circumstances." She was right. The documentary had sparked a broader conversation about workplace fairness, hidden talent, and the strategic approaches employees could use to gain recognition for their contributions. My speaking schedule became fully booked, with requests from organizations around the world who wanted to learn how to identify and develop overlooked talent within their existing teams. Miss Sterling asked an audience member at a corporate leadership conference in London, "What do you say to critics who argue that your approach is essentially teaching employees to be manipulative?" "I say there's a difference between manipulation and strategy," I replied. "Manipulation involves deception and exploitation. Strategy involves building genuine capabilities and creating opportunities to demonstrate them effectively." "But you did deceive your co-workers about your background." "I conducted field research to understand organizational dynamics from multiple perspectives. My co-workers' treatment of someone they perceived as powerless revealed their true character and management capabilities." The documentary and speaking engagements had made me something I never expected to become: a public figure associated with workplace transformation and social justice. But the most meaningful feedback came from individual employees who had used our strategies to advance in their careers. 5 years after overhearing my colleagues plan my professional exclusion, I was invited to deliver the keynote address at the National Conference on Workplace Equity. The venue was significant. The same convention center where I had first learned about the systematic research underlying my consulting methodology. Standing before an audience of 2,000 HR professionals, union leaders, and workplace advocates, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from excluded employee to industry thought leader. 5 years ago, I discovered that colleagues I trusted were systematically planning to exclude me from advancement opportunities based on assumptions about my capabilities rather than evidence of my performance. The audience was silent, engaged by the personal nature of the opening. I had a choice about how to respond. I could have confronted them directly, complained to higher management, or simply accepted their assessment and looked for opportunities elsewhere. I clicked to my first slide, showing the growth trajectory of organizations that had implemented our talent development programs. Instead, I chose to build irrefutable evidence of my capabilities while systematically documenting their decision-making processes. The result wasn't just personal vindication, it was the development of systems that have helped thousands of employees receive recognition for their true contributions. I explained how our research had revealed patterns of bias and exclusion that existed across industries, and how targeted interventions could dramatically improve both employee satisfaction and organizational performance. The most important lesson I've learned is that being underestimated is only a permanent condition if you accept it as one. Every organization has hidden talent that could drive innovation and improvement if given appropriate opportunities. During the question and answer session, a young man raised his hand. "Miss Sterling, what advice would you give to someone who feels trapped in a workplace where their contributions aren't valued?" Start documenting everything: your ideas, your achievements, your problem-solving contributions. Build relationships with fair-minded colleagues who can serve as witnesses to your capabilities. And most importantly, develop your skills, whether or not you're being promoted, because competence creates its own opportunities. After the conference, I was approached by a representative from the Department of Labor who wanted to discuss adapting our assessment tools for federal workplace equity programs. "Miss Sterling, we believe your methodology could help government agencies identify and address systemic barriers to advancement for underrepresented employees. It was an opportunity to scale our impact beyond individual organizations to influence policy at the national level." That evening, I called Taylor to share the day's developments. "Victoria, do you ever miss the restaurant business?" I thought about the question. I miss the immediate satisfaction of solving operational problems and seeing customers enjoy excellent service. But I don't miss being underestimated or having to prove my capabilities to people who made judgments based on assumptions. Any regrets about how you handled the situation with Brandon, Kimber, and Austin? No regrets about exposing their behavior or changing the power dynamics. Some regret about the pain it caused them personally, but they chose to exclude and diminish a colleague based on prejudice rather than evidence. Do you think they learned from the experience? Austin and Kimber clearly learned and grew. Brandon, I'm not sure, but transformation requires both opportunity and willingness to change. As I concluded the call and prepared for bed in my hotel room overlooking the city, I realized that my story had become something larger than personal revenge or even professional success. It had become a model for how individuals could transform systems that undervalued their contributions. The woman who had once been dismissed as too quiet and lacking leadership potential now spent her days helping organizations recognize that true leadership came in many forms and that their success depended on identifying and developing all of them. My journey from excluded employee to workplace transformation expert had taught me that the most satisfying revenge isn't destroying those who underestimated you. It's building something so valuable that their opinions become irrelevant. As I looked out at the city lights below, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from turning betrayal into purpose, exclusion into expertise, and personal pain into systematic change that would help countless others avoid the same experience. Tomorrow, I would begin working with the Department of Labor to implement our assessment tools across federal agencies. Next month, I would speak at conferences in 3 countries about building inclusive advancement systems. But tonight, I simply felt grateful that 4 colleagues who tried to exclude me had inadvertently launched a career dedicated to ensuring that talented, underestimated people would never again have to accept being overlooked or dismissed. The restaurant industry's Entrepreneur of the Year had become something even more meaningful. An advocate for hidden talent everywhere, armed with the strategic patience and irrefutable competence to change the systems that had once tried to silence her.